Thank you all for joining us again, for being back in this space with us. Um, I know that it has been a long weekend. I hope it has been a good and enriching weekend as well. Amen. Um, as you know, many times during the 16 years of Ecumenical Advocacy Days, we have called on and pulled from Dr. King's legacy, from his work, from his prophetic ministry, either as themes or in just talking about this being the part of the beloved community, or what does it take to be a part of the beloved community? What does it take to become the beloved community? And so as we mark this year, 50 years since Dr. King's assassination, we wanted to just pause a moment and to really reflect and remember Dr. King, and to just think about not just his legacy, but also the way forward. We know that in many ways, for many of us, you turn on the news and you feel as if we're being dragged back 50 years ago, or maybe even further back, kicking and screaming and shaking our heads and wondering what in the world is going on. And so we know that even his words, the urgency of now, right? When we think about our theme, A World Uprooted, responding to migrants, refugees, and displaced people, we know that there is some urgency around those issues. There's urgency around the resurgence of white supremacy. There's urgency around some of the racial justice issues that we're experiencing. There's urgency around the push factors that we identified: corruption and climate change and violent conflict. And so it behooves us as God's people to be urgent about it. And so for tonight, we want to just take a moment and just kind of breathe out, to reflect, to breathe in, to take a breath, to pause, to think about what Dr. King has meant to us. I said earlier, just in reference to Reverend Julian DeShazier, and so many people who I've interacted with over this weekend. I think about starting out with Reverend Dr. Elizabeth Conde Frazier, and was she not a prophet in our midst, right? And Julian DeShazier, we had musicians who were prophets in our midst. We had Bishop Ramirez this morning, a prophet in our midst. We've had the panel of dreamers, prophets in our midst. We had an international panel with prophets in our midst. And so it makes sense for us to just take a little bit of a moment to just reflect on somebody who I think our whole nation considers a prophet who was in our midst. The other thing we need to recognize is that when he was alive, everybody wasn't loving on him like they are now. Everybody wasn't quoting the urgency of now like they are now. And so I think that's important to remember, even as we prepare to go up on the hill tomorrow, that it's not about how they respond. It's not about what they say. It's not about how their faces look. I think about often that Jeremiah text when God says, do not look at their faces, because their faces can trip you up, right? So you just kind of dig deep and you keep going regardless of what their faces look like, and press on toward the mark of the high calling that is in Christ Jesus. And so we want to definitely just start. We've had a lot going on. I know that we've had Act Now to End Racism. We've had one march after another, one rally after another. I guess even going back, good grief, as far as last year with health care and the tax bill, and now with DACA and so many things going on, that I wanted to make sure we had some sort of video presentation about Dr. King's life. And that's why you have friends who have gifts, I'm just saying. So one of my gifted friends has put together a powerful, I think, video to kind of get us started. And I want us to just watch that. It's just a few minutes. So let's give it up for Reverend Dawn Sanders, who helped put this together. Thank you. And after we do that, I want to introduce our moderator and get us started. So.
down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, and whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality. Did you ever stop to think that you can't leave for your job in the morning without being dependent on most of the world? You get up in the morning and go to the bathroom and reach over for a sponge, and that's handed to you by a Pacific Islander. You reach for a bar of soap, and that's given to you at the hands of a Frenchman. And then you go in the kitchen to drink your coffee for the morning. That's poured in your cup by a South American. Or maybe you want tea. That's poured in your cup by a Chinese. Or maybe you're desirous of having cocoa for breakfast, and that's poured in your cup by a West African. And then you reach over for your toast, and that's given to you at the hands of an English-speaking farmer, not to mention the baker. And before you finish eating breakfast in the morning, you're dependent on more than half of the world. This is the way our universe is structured. It is its interrelated quality. We aren't going to have peace on earth until we recognize this basic fact.
Thank you. A prophet before his own time, even. One thing I did not do this morning that I want to do just right now is just to thank Angelique and Mike Newroth for being our co-moderators all weekend. I meant to do that. I appreciate you all for. Thank you, Mike. And I know Angelique will be back, so we'll give her thanks. So without further ado, I have the extreme pleasure of really introducing to some, but presenting to others, another prophet in our midst, a giant in our midst, really, truly, Dr. Valerie Bridgman. It's funny, I am thinking of, even as the NBA basketball finals are going on now, and Dr. Valerie is a big basketball fan. She actually used to be a basketball coach. This is true. She'll have to tell you about that story later. But she is taller and more gifted than the most gifted basketball player. And surely, even in theological circles, amen, is a giant amongst giants. And so we are just so pleased to have her. She, I think she's written a Bible. I'm just kidding. But she could write a Bible. I mean, she is a gifted Old Testament scholar. She is a womanist scholar. She has done so much to upbuild God's kingdom. She has been a pastor. She actually has done, as part of her ministry, kind of a spoken word on Sunday evenings, I think it was, in Texas with her members. She is creative and just really a genius, and she is my friend. She is the president and founder of Women Preach, which really helps women find their prophetic voice. And has just done some powerful work to help women to kind of delve deep and to be able to express and speak and stand flat-footed and preach the word of God. And so I am so grateful for her. She has not been feeling well, but like I said, she is my friend. Some of you may know this term, ride or die. So we're ride or die in Jesus' name, because we love Jesus. But She is going to be our moderator of another group of giants who are in our midst and people who have really been on the front lines of doing ministry, a wonderful group of faith leaders who will talk about remembering Dr. King in a world uprooted. So I introduce to some and present to others Dr. Valerie Bridgman, who will take over the program from here.
So a couple of things as I prepare to introduce the people who will be on the panel. If I start coughing up my lung, I'm going to leave and somebody's going to take over. I don't know who that's going to be. But when you're friends, you suck on cough drops and come anyway. And also, I think I should, since my boss paid for me to be here, tell you that I'm the interim dean at Methodist Theological School in Ohio, where I also teach Hebrew Bible and preaching. So I don't want to not say that for the public since they so graciously paid for my being here. Thank God for a gracious boss. So tonight, the way this is going to work, and I'm telling you the way this is going to work so you can hold us accountable to this, we're going to have a conversation among ourselves, really a conversation and not just a kind of pontificating of each person just listening to think what they want to say about themselves or whatever, but to really try to have a conversation, you know how we do, to really try to have a conversation around where do we go from here? And particularly I want us to be thinking, and I'm saying this because you'll have a Q&A time, and the reason I'm telling you now is so you can be planning your questions. Now, in my mind, a question is, I don't know, 8 words or less with a question mark at the end. So, so if you get up and start pontificating, you know, I don't, if you have an essay before you get to the question, I am telling you now, I'm going to cut you off. So that you don't get offended after the fact, you can get offended now. That I am going to cut you off if that happens. Jim Winkler knows that because I said to Dr. J. Herbert Nelson, who's both of them are on this panel, and I walked up to him and I said, so this is a conversation. I want you all to speak, not in sound bites, but thoughtfully, carefully, short. You know, KISS, short. And so Mr. Winkler, Jim says, so you're going to cut off the state of Kirk? I said, we have a long history. He didn't even have to ask if that's true. Yes, I will cut off the state of Kirk. And I will cut off Sister Simone. So this is how this will work. So you will know how we're going. Everybody clear about what we're doing? Yay! So let's bring them up. Y'all just come up and I'll introduce you as you're coming. The Dr. J. Herbert Nelson, who wave as you're coming, is the stated clerk for the Presbyterian Church USA, and he's the first African American to hold that position. Ms. Diane Randall Wave, so they'll know who you are, is the Executive Secretary of the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Mr. Jim Winkler, sit down, just find a place, you can sit. Wave, as I call your name, Mr. Jim Winkler is President and General Secretary of the National Council of Churches. Did you wave?
I did.
Oh, okay, I didn't see you. They even applauded. Oh, okay. They didn't applaud. Why didn't y'all applaud for Jim? The Reverend Lamont Anthony Wells, my friend, so this may not go well, Director for Evangelical Mission in the Metro New York Synod, and President of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America's African Descent Lutheran Association. Okay. Reverend Dr. Velda Love, wave, is the Minister for Racial Justice and Witness Ministry for the United Church of Christ, and then Sister Simone Campbell. I never know what the answer is. Sisters of Social Service, the Executive Director of Network Lobby for Catholic social justice. I know her from sisters, nuns on the bus. I was like, it ain't sisters on the bus. That's not what it is.
Tonight is nuns off the bus.
Tonight is nuns off the bus. Okay, so everybody grab you some water because you'll want it. I know. Yay. Wasn't it nice for them to set it up so we could all have water? This is so cool. This is so cool. Yes. All right. What do you need? So you need your phone. So how do we turn this one on? Tell us how to turn this on. So a year before he was murdered, I've been, let me just say that I have been really bothered with people talking about King as if he just kind of laid down and went to sleep in 1968. No, he was murdered. And I don't even know that killed is a good word for this. No, he was murdered, and it was violent, and it was at the moment where he was least liked by everybody in the country, including liberals. And I recently just heard his children didn't want him to go that day. So thinking about that, a year before that, he had pulled back to think about what a beloved community might look like. And so I'm going to ask each of you as we reflect, I'm going to pass the mic around, I don't care who starts, that he in 1967 talked about the triple evils that faced the beloved community. Y'all remember this? If you don't remember, you remember reading about it. So one of them was materialism, the way it shows up in poverty, unemployment, homelessness, food insecurity, malnutrition, illiteracy, infant mortality, and the ghettoizing of communities so that they are cut off from resources. So that's one. Then, of course, racism, which seems to be the hydra that grows another head no matter how we slice at it. And it shows up in many ways: apartheid, prejudices, anti-Semitism, sexism, the intersections of what Kimberly Crenshaw calls the intersectionality of the way racism shows up, what it does when it's women, what it does when it's queer folk, ageism, ableism, all kinds of stereotypes. And then, of course, war, militarism, which he mentioned, and which shows up, in colonialism, imperialism, domestic violence, rape as a weapon of war, terrorism, violence, drugs, child abuse, as a form of the ways in which war gets carried out, not just internationally, but also domestically. So I wonder, given these triple evils that disrupt community, where do we go now as we are getting ready to use Dr. Alexander, or Reverend Alexander's phrase, to storm the hill tomorrow? What does it mean to reflect on either of these big three items in an era where all of them seem to be like heightened in ways that we couldn't even imagine 50 years ago? So who wants to go first? I'm passing the mic, but it doesn't matter. Everybody's going, no, wait a minute.
Diane Randall. I work with the Friends Committee on National Legislation, which is a Quaker lobby organization. So a couple of things reflecting. I remember listening to Dr. King when I was coming of age, when I was coming into my teenage years, and recognizing that his words, I don't know that I recognized this at the time, but that his words reflected what I learned, not in my Quaker upbringing, because I was brought up as a Lutheran, happy to be here with my colleague, but understanding that the words that Dr. King and the motive of his way of being in the world reflected Jesus' teaching in the most profound way. And as an adult, I came to Quakerism, and part of the reason that I was attracted to it was the idea of a completely integrated life. And I think Dr. King truly tried to live that integrated life. And I think we see that where I find hope and where I see that now is when we see the movement that is authentically looking at the connection and the intersectionality. We learn this from each other. We learn it from watching each other. We learn it from watching people who are much younger than I am, who are in the forefront of living out a sense of passion and a sense of looking for wholeness. I think there's a profound question about where churches will be in this era. But I will also say I find extraordinary hope in the idea of recognizing the kingdom of God is not just within us, but it is among us, and we can live into it.
So who else to answer the question about where churches will be? That's the question that was raised.
Where churches will be. This is the thing that I learned from Dr. King, is that we are all the church, and it is not left to some institutional leaders to do this work for us. The fact is, with this structural racism that's going on in our nation, with the structural divisions that we have caused by legislation to create the militarism, the racism, and the poverty, the economic imbalance. Tax bill is Exhibit A of that, but don't get me started on that one. But the fact is, it's us who are the church. And we do not have the luxury to sit here and point fingers at some other institutional leader that we want to take on this mantle for us because it's kind of scary. No, it's up to us. And so we have to answer the question, where is the church going to be? Wherever we are.
I want to suggest that
Use the mic.
like the,
Yes, use the mic.
all right. I want to suggest that the church is going through the same level of wrestling. The question of power, the question of what it used to be and how it used to be represented in this nation, standing, and also certainly filling the coffers on Sunday morning. All of these are challenges, I believe, that the church right now has to struggle with. When we look at what Dr. King was speaking of, it is about domination and control. And the church is wrestling with that same issue. Are we the church with the most members? Are we the church that has the largest building on the block? And if you look denominationally, are we what we used to be probably before the fallout of the denomination or the beginning of it in the 1960s? And so the question is, how do we, and I think what Dr. King emulated through his life was, how do we take our minds off of ourselves and our possessions and what our earthly gain will be, and place our minds on something far deeper than that. And that is the command of Jesus, to love your neighbor as you love yourself, to love your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And all of that requires recognizing that what we have and the fact that we are here today just to breathe another breath is not in our hands. It's in the hands of an awesome God who deserves everything we have for the redemption of the world in which God has created.
So the way I want to approach this is really about deconstructing. And when we talk about the church today, it is moving out of this agenda-based ownership, silo-keeping, theologically, biblically structure that keeps us separated. In ways in which we decolonialize our biblical theological understandings. Because the church can't be the church of a radical Martin Luther King vision unless we are sitting at the table and we are deconstructing whiteness in a way that white supremacy no longer dominates our thinking around its biblical and theological teachings. And so when we are able to have that conversation, then we are able to have a level of conversation around why are we still here 600 years later and 50 years later after his death. The other piece to this would be how do we deconstruct and then move back into reconstruct communities where people see us being the church, where we can stop being a building, where we can suspend Sunday worship, where we can then move into people's lives in a real way. When we talk about Jesus, we're not talking about Jesus sitting at 11 a.m. service. We're talking about Jesus being in the community on Sunday morning, and that we are there together. So that is a different kind of movement for the church forward, and we will talk more about that, but that's where I want to begin. If we are deconstructing in order to reconstruct the life. Jesus didn't have a car, right? And so we know that people geographically are able to move in these spaces. He put 25,000 miles on his feet, plus. And so what does it mean for our bodies, because we see bodies falling daily? What does it mean to be the bodies and the feet of Christ? How many miles can we log together to do this deconstruction in a real way, and this removing of our agendas to keep the church in its reformed state?
Did you want to say anything to that, Lamont or Jen?
Not being one that grew up with King in my life, just age, I've had to be intentional about connecting with Dr. King in such a way. So when you talk about 1967, where do we go from here? He added a tag to that, chaos or community. And I don't think the church, we as a church, have fully made a decision whether we want to deal with drama and chaos or really build community. One of the things and the reasons why I say that is we have spent probably the last 50 years dealing with so many minute things that did not really matter and not focus on the main thing of being connected. We have sought actually on things and have created more of a division amongst us, particularly even though this is Ecumenical Advocacy Days weeks, there are things about us that we have decided that we wanted to keep distinct rather than focus on those things that can bring us together to achieve the things that are possible for us to do as the body of Christ.
Well, I'd pick up a little bit on what Jay Herbert said about our denominational structures are in a period of rapid change, and I think you had asked the question, where will we be? And in a lot of ways, I don't know that we can say precisely where we'll be as structures, but it's going to be a lot different than it is now. And if our congregations and our member denominations cannot grasp that our young people want the church to be in the streets and on the front lines and dealing with militarism, racism, and materialism, then they will die a well-deserved death. And we're seeing it happen around. We actually work a lot more closely than we did in the early years of Dr. King's ministry. But things have changed so dramatically in terms of the life of our congregations that I don't know that we've really, we still desire so much to have that period of Christian preeminence, if you will, and of place of privilege, and we remain right now in flux in changing from that white-dominated middle-class nation to a multicultural, diverse, beloved community. I pray that what we're dealing with now is the rear guard action of these forces that want to take us backward. And those of us in this room and those who are part of this struggle have some, as Dr. King would say and did say, some difficult days ahead. But I'm with him. I believe we're going to get to the promised land. I don't know if we'll get there, but we have to be part of this struggle to help our people get to the promised land.
I want to, that actually is a good segue into the whole issue of struggle. So Barbara A. Holmes wrote a book called Race and the Cosmos. Her basic premise in the book is that the cosmos expands and contracts continually, and so does social justice movements. That part of why we get weary and tired and exhausted is because we expect a teleos, an end to the struggle. And we never see the contraction coming. And so I wonder, I've been thinking about that for this conversation. I wonder what kind of resources may we foster, support to help people stay in the struggle, because it's not going to end, right? There's not this one victory that's going to end all of the isms that we see in front of us. What kinds of spiritual, emotional resources to kind of answer this question about expanding, contracting? Let me say this also. Fania Davis, you know her sister probably more than her, Angela Davis. But Fania says, you can't live in a state of rage. That can't be what fuels your movement. So what's the fuel for the movement for you? Okay.
One of the things that I had to learn very quickly is to practice Sabbath. I mean, and allow for respite. And allow for respite to occur in my life, that I can't do it all, I shouldn't do it all, and I don't have to do it all. That was the biggest learning that I had to engage. But that's one of the gifts that we have. I mean, that's something that we are commanded to do. And as a church and as a people, to teach others how to chill out and rest and get some Sabbath. I remember when we first met, particularly in Ferguson, and I was exhausted by, shouting, and who wants to yell and shout all the time? I mean, I want to chill sometime, have a cocktail. No, anyway, but the reality is that we don't really practice that safely and openly. We teach, and in fact, it was a part of the DNA of what my elders taught me, that you don't let them see you cry, you keep on fighting and all that kind of stuff like that. And that's not a very healthy way, and it wasn't really modeled well. We may see pictures now of Dr. King, hanging out with Zanona and others, whatever, but we saw him marching, even Malcolm. I mean, we just saw all the kinds of things that seem to show strength and power, but we never, and I think our greatest gift as a church is to teach people how to chill out and to do the work so that we can rest and get back up again for another time and another day.
So to move on that point, I think it's really what's been helpful over the last couple of years is to create support group. And part of that is to have support. So one of the ways in which one gets healthy is to have my sisterhood sit down and talk about what it means to breathe. Because if you're not breathing, you're not really alive. And you can do and do and do. And so if you're not breathing and thinking and resting with the people that can love on you so that you all can get back out and do this work in an intentional kind of way, then you burn out. And what we've noticed in terms of the activism that took place in Ferguson is that young people are dying, and not always from just the violence of allowing the activism has killed them in a way. I mean, we've got this real violence that's being perpetrated on black bodies, but then we've got young people dying sooner than they should. And so we, elders, who have experienced both the 60s and now moving into 2018, can be the catalyst and the support system for those who will be moving in our shoes, in our places, both in the church and in the street. And so one of those resources is strategy. Because you can march and yell and holler, but if you don't sit still and develop some well-balanced recharging and have some strategy about how you're going to keep this sustaining movement, because what I recognize is that this is not going to end tomorrow as much as I'd like it to. That racism is an ongoing, serious disease for us. And militarism is not going to end tomorrow. And so for all of us who will be on the Hill and looking at these issues, what is the strategy when you leave here? And who do you have as your support system to talk into you, lean into you as you continue to do this work?
I think that we have to find a way to experience joy in our worship communities and somehow balance it with discomfort. Oftentimes when we have celebrations, we want to focus just on the happiness. There's a way to do both. For years, I led a Sunday school, an adult Sunday school class that started out as a 6-week study on the Methodist social principles. It went for 9 years. And the reason that it kept going was that the most angry, frankly, and conservative person in the class at the end of 6 weeks chased me down the hallway. I thought he wanted to get in one last jab, but he said, "I've talked to the pastor, we can keep going." And I said, "Why do you want to do that?" And he said, "Well, we're actually talking about real life. Real life matters." And we established a culture in that group where we did some of the traditional things of having a picnic together and taking covered dishes to one another's homes when someone had passed or when someone was ill. But we set an atmosphere where we could disagree strenuously with one another, but not walk away embittered. And it wasn't actually that hard to do, but it took effort. And there we had that balance between laughter and joy and holding one another accountable and challenging some really ridiculous assumptions that people brought to the table, often based on ignorance, on lack of context, knowledge, history, theology, and so forth. And people grew. Not many of them changed their attitudes as much as I'd liked, but they grew and they were nurtured by it. And that's the kind of atmosphere I think we need to consciously encourage in a lot more of our congregations.
Well, I want to follow on both of you because, okay, I was told that I'm the Catholic on the panel, so I can add Catholic. So Pope Francis, it'll be 2 weeks ago tomorrow, released this exhortation, which is like a big encouragement. And I encourage anybody that's interested to read it because it is amazing. And he says there are 5 characteristics of holiness in our world today. And I, quite frankly, don't think a lot about holiness. I think about strategy. I think about being on the front lines of Sabbath, of being engaged, strategic, doing all this. And here's what he says. These are the 5. The first is to be curious about knowing each other's story. Yeah. And I add, let our hearts be broken by each other, because when it's broken open, when our hearts are broken open, there's room for everybody. Right. The second thing he says is that we need, what you were saying, Jim, joy and a sense of humor. Now, who thought that was holiness? But what yeah, it's the part I enjoy most. But what he said was it means that we know we're not the measure in order to have a sense of joy. The third, he says, is community, that we've got to live vibrantly, publicly in community, and that is a witness to the gospel, to the love that we know that God has for us. The fourth, he says, is to be passionate and bold. Now, who thought of holiness that way? Usually I think of holiness as hiding out in a chapel someplace, being quiet, but he says that's not it at all these days. And finally he says, which I think goes to the biggest challenge for us activists, is to live in constant prayer, where we know we're not the measure, of making it happen. We're only vessels, clay vessels who are willing to be used. And for me, those 5 public acts of holiness, doesn't our nation cry out for that? So that's what I'm advocating these days.
I pray for that for the Holy Catholic Church. I pray for that for the Holy Catholic Church.
Amen.
That's right.
Yes.
One of the great challenges for me over the years has been overcommitment, to be driven by the cause and not necessarily by common sense, and not listening to what my body has been saying. And certainly, as the younger I was, the more that I felt that I could continue to do and that I was supposed to do because I was younger. And then your body has a way of catching up with you and reminding you that you're not as young as you used to be, and adjustments have to be made. And so
Just say amen, church.
yeah. So my theory and my practice now comes through having hit walls from time to time and having to figure out how to adjust. And I think one of the things that understanding about justice work in particular is it can be a very lonely life. Yes. Where you're out there running for the cause, half the people in the community don't know why you keep doing it this way. And even folks in your own household can not know. And so the question is finding where is the anchor, and where is the place by which you really can rest and you can give your body and your mind and spirit rest. And sometimes that's in the family, and that's where I found it, because they are honest with me and they tell me exactly who I am and what I am, and I go to my room and I think about it, and I go to bed and I wake up and I said they were right. And I think the second piece that has been very helpful is who we align ourselves with outside of the work, who don't carry those same conversations about the work all of the time, but who talk about other things, folks you can go to a ball game with, folks you can go to a play with, or go somewhere else and just enjoy yourself and be yourself without having to be the preacher, having to be the chaplain for the group. And so, and I think the third piece for me, and the final part, has been really understanding who I am. I'm a person who had a bad model of self-care in my father, who was also a preacher and a civil rights activist. And out of all of that, he ran and ran and ran and ran. And so every now and then I have to go back to remember the life he lived, which on paper and in a lot of other ways is a very good life. But the toil and the toll that it took on him is what I have to stop and remember as he died at 63 years old. And had a whole lot of things going on by that time physically. And so I think those are the kinds of things that I have to remember, and remember self-care and pacing myself, as my mother would say if she were here today physically. And I think that's one of the challenges.
Yeah.
You know, there was a reference to chaos or community. And a lot of times when I think of what's happening in Washington, D.C. now, I think of chaos. I think particularly the White House as being chaotic. And I think a lot about community because it is such a powerful element. And it's a powerful element of our work. Many of us work together on a regular basis with other people in this room. And it is, I have come, particularly in the last year or so, to appreciate that at a much deeper level. The notion of not having to do everything, as my wise friend here says, that we each have to do our own part and determine what that is, and that we build community. As Quakers, many of us find our practice of worship to be in silence, to be in corporate silence. That is, to sit together and wait, and to what we call waiting worship, and to listen to the silence and to listen to the messages that may arise. And that, for me, is a very powerful way to be. We've recently started holding a time of silent reflection every Wednesday afternoon, and we're right across from the Senate office building, and there's a real power to pray in that space for those people over there. I just want to say, I want to thank all of you who are going on the Hill tomorrow, because I think this willingness to speak, and to speak in places that we aren't always comfortable, we don't know what's going to happen, but we carry ourselves into that space with a kind of love and a willingness to both speak, but also to listen, is very powerful. And it's not about convincing someone else, it is about witnessing, and it is about being present and being constant. It's not a one-off situation. It is over the long term, which is why self-care is so important. I am so grateful to have people around me who also tell me, who speak truth to me. I have a daughter who says to me, "Mom, stop looking at Twitter. Put it down. Don't do that anymore." I have other people who just say to me, "Let's go out for a walk." But I think finding where we see that joy, the music that we started with tonight, what a blessing. You know, where are these moments? Even if they're momentary, where do we find them? And let them renew us.
Thank you all. I'm going to shift us. Let me say this, though, before I shift us. Reverend Love and Reverend Wells spoke to the movement in Ferguson, and I don't want to leave that without saying, I do want to say that the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter actually don't just yell and shout. I know y'all weren't saying that, but I want to be on record as saying that's not what we're saying. They have strategy and love pockets. I call them love pockets. The way in which people who provide food and provide respite care and also strategy. So if you want to look that up online, you can find it, because oftentimes what we see about all of our movements is only what the media wants us to see, and none of that is accurate. I say as a former reporter. I'm just saying. Shifting now in this next 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to you all. We have been here reflecting on displaced peoples. People displaced for many and various reasons. The war against sanctuary churches and sanctuary cities, as people have tried to provide hospitality for our siblings who are under assault, people who know no other country but this country as their own and being deported to places they don't know. Or people who are seeking refugee. I'm still struck by the bombing of a place for poisoning its people, for people that we won't allow for war refugee. It's just an odd thing to me. I don't quite get it, so if somebody can explain it to me later, feel free. But what it means to have so many people, this isn't the only time that people have been displaced and on the move in the world, but it feels overwhelming. This includes, for me, gentrification in cities, where people who have lived in places for years own their homes and then lose them because they can't pay taxes because of gentrification. I mean, there are a lot of ways to address this. So if you all will reflect now in this next few minutes on how are you thinking about your work as it relates to these displaced persons, whoever wants to go. And you talk among yourselves.
One of the spaces where we have been pretty much in the Presbyterian Church USA has been one of the places that we have been in the PCUSA has been to really take on this issue of the refugee crisis in the United States, the issue of a denomination that needs to become blacker and browner in order to really have any significant numbers going into the future of this country and within our denominational structure. And looking very forthrightly as to what does it mean to look at those communities in the United States that have been left behind. I've been to at least 3 congregations in our denomination where in one instance an individual was picked up after dropping his child off to school in the morning in New Jersey and was picked up by ICE and held in detention. Another one in New Hampshire where I sat in the ICE deportation center waiting for a hearing to finish and to see a gentleman who had to buy his own ticket in order to go back to Indonesia. And I don't know if you know much about Indonesia, but if he goes back as a Christian, he will die. I have also had the opportunity to spend time among some who have been refugees from, who have basically been in this country for a very long time and then find themselves being picked up as well. The challenges to family, the challenges to individuals who are deeply connected to them, the moving from one apartment to another when they think that a raid might happen and taking on a different address. This has really created, I think, a true hypocrisy to the issue of give me your tired, your poor, your huddle masters who yearn to breathe free. And it is a contradiction to who we say we are as a nation. And I think it is incumbent for the church today to frontally challenge that, because the reality is that every last one of us sitting in this room is in fact an immigrant unless you are a Native American. And I think that is the challenge that we have not realized through the propaganda mill that is operating now out of Washington, D.C. And it has to be challenged as not just an immigration issue, but as a human rights issue and a violation of human rights by the United States government.
Or unless you are the descendant of an enslaved person.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to clarify. Not all of us came willingly.
That's
But
what,
you still,
But we're here.
you still can.
We're here.
so I think part of this too is to recognize the radical inhospitality that we offer, even in our churches. We are living in a climate of fear. And that fear has induced us sometimes to close our doors after Sunday worship and keep them closed until Bible study on Wednesday, and we may feed a few people and then we open them again. And so one of the ways I think is to revisit this sense of what it means to be a radical hospitality center, and have spaces and homes where people can come and feel welcomed. And that welcome also means that we stop labeling people in ways that if they are sisters and brothers and we are Christians, they're not strangers. They are family. They are not aliens. They're not illegal. They are family. And that's radical hospitality. Because I think it's still, even as a woman of color or a woman of African descent, I don't always feel that radical hospitality in some churches. And so how could someone who is coming from another country feel that way? And how do we extend that radical hospitality? So I think it's one of those, we're thinking about this, how do we welcome not strangers, but our kin? Because that's the kingdom of God.
I remember in the local church that I was a member of in my teenage years, in the 70s, we had a refugee from Pinochet's Chile, and we had refugees from Vietnam, and we had actively, as a congregation, resettled those folks in our town. One of those families was an active part of our church, but that helped that local congregation see beyond its own four walls and see that it was part of this single web of destiny, a garment of destiny. This is going to become ever more pronounced in the years ahead, as we know that the numbers of displaced people has grown and will continue to grow for a variety of factors, one of course being climate change. And this will be an enormous challenge to our houses of worship, because the pressure to build the walls and close the gates and circle the wagons will become extremely intense. And that's why I know that we have a history of many thousands of our houses of worship actively being involved in refugee resettlement ministries and assisting migrants. But I'm guessing it's a fraction of our congregations. And we've got to get more people involved in that, because that is what changes their worldview and expands it. And it may even be that somehow we have to find a way to do that now, because I hope I'm wrong, but I fear that we are really facing in the years ahead a almost cataclysmic worldwide issue.
Carrying Dr. King's thematic statement, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. If we really take that into account when we are talking about displaced persons, realizing that we can't afford to watch others suffer or be displaced and be disengaged from that, I'm reminded, like the scripture teaches in Proverbs, don't withhold good from those to whom it's due when it's in your power to act, right? So we've allowed some of these things to occur out of our own comforts. I live in Harlem now, and I think about, who lives with me in Harlem and how I've engaged in that particular area. We have a church in Harlem that we were about to sell, but we stopped because I was at the table and said, if we do this, then we let go of history. We let go of all kinds of things. So we have to bring up the subject of prejudice is something that we all engage in, but how can we stop that as a church, because we have the Spirit of God that allows us to make these thoughtful decisions. How do we prefer others? And stop being selfish and say, well, this is going to be good for the community. Whole Foods is right at 125th, but how can we prefer others and if we are going to allow some of these changes, that they're not harmful or hurtful? So what happens to those who are displaced? And did we give them something, because we wanted to move back to the city, did we give them something better even? Or did we just shift them out to a particular area that we don't really care about anymore and just replacing it?
As you were talking, I was just really struck by what Dr. King was saying in the letter from the Birmingham jail about he was so disappointed with white moderates and white moderate churches about how reluctant and timid and shy and proper and careful they are, elitist. And this, I want to say, for those of us walking in white skin, we have some serious, serious work to do to put down our privilege and to be missionaries to our fellow folks walking in white skin and invite them to community where it builds bridges and draws down the barriers. Because, quite frankly, it's those of us that look like me that keep building the barriers because of fear. And this, we've got to stop. The gospel has nothing to do with this division and purism and entitlement. And how do we, white folks, acknowledge the fact that we come with the expectation of being deferred to, being in charge, having our voice listened to, not being left out of the planning meeting, So the real challenge here, I believe, is for the challenge of Dr. King is to the white community to let it go and to wake up. I'll never forget being in when we were doing the bus, we were in Fort Wayne, Indiana, talking to 4 women who had recently gotten permanent housing after long-term homelessness with their families, and they each had at least 2 kids. One woman had 4 kids, but being homeless with 4 kids, I was at work, And 3 of the women are African American, and we're talking about being in a fabric store and being getting served, getting the fabric cut, and a white woman comes in and says to the clerk, "You got to wait on me. Here, I need this." And the clerk said, to her credit, a white woman, "I'm waiting on another customer. I'll be right with you." This white woman went to the manager and said, and the manager came over and said, "Serve her first." This happens all too often, and it is wrong.
Sin. Let's call it sin.
It is sin. It is sin. And those of us in white skin, we need to be missionaries. Missionaries that break this open and break it apart. And this is why we talk at Network more about white privilege and structural racism, structural preference, because too often when I, as a white person, hear the word race, I think it's about people of color and their work. And the fact is, it's our work.
I just want to hug her right now. I'm like we could sing a hymn and go home up the Mount of Olive, whatever. But no. Wow. What that makes me want to then further ask is the language that we're using, right? I have become abundantly aware of the way white privilege and white fragility works in my world. White women's tears, a white woman said to me, I'm quoting a white woman, "White women's tears are weapons of mass destruction. They will get a whole lot of us killed. All a white woman has to do is start crying, and some of us we're dead." And so I'm wondering about the language we use. But the other piece here is, I think underneath here is a theology of lack, that we don't believe in abundance. We don't believe that the earth belongs to God and the fullness in it and all of us who dwell in it, and there's enough for everybody. That I actually think we don't function church-wise as if we believe there's enough for everyone. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I am challenged by this language of inclusion. I don't have another word for it. I don't. And I'm a person of privilege in that I have education, I have a job with a 403B. So, in a lot of ways, I benefit from systems. I don't have another word for it, but I'm beginning to think that the word inclusion still has in it the notion that I can decide whether you are in or out. Because it is my party, and I can invite you if I want to. When in fact, I think there's a theology we need to develop. I don't have a word for it. I'm waiting on you good theologians out there to help me with this, where the world body, the cosmos, belongs to God. And we function in it. We can move over at the table, but we can't invite anybody to the table because it's not our table. You understand what I'm trying to get at? I don't know how to talk about that, but anybody want to take that up?
I want to take that on. I want to take that on. I want to take that on. So part of this is about the Christian church. And what it means is language is that there is no dominant culture in the Christian church. There's no dominant language. That we are not minorities. People of color are not minorities. These labels have to go in the church. Right. And if we don't deconstruct these labels in the church, then we continue to function out of this white male dominance or white female dominance that keeps people in a position. So we haven't yet learned how to deconstruct or get rid of this language that we are using around dominance. What does that mean? It means that we need to look at our scriptures. It means that we need to look at our theology from people of color, people who are struggling, right? and people who are oppressed. Your text, our text, is written under 5 different kinds of oppression. And ways in which our stories, I mean, I love the Abraham and Sarah story, but nobody talks about Hagar but Dolores Williams, right? And ways in which those stories are now told from a cultural perspective, that gives us new language. That gives us a way to get rid of this space of white fragility. Amen. It also gives us power over ourselves as people to begin to talk about the human community, because God created humanity. Humans created racism. And when we begin to look at that text in Genesis where God creates and breathes into humanity, God makes sure that God is big enough to create humanity the way God intends. And we can stop labeling people. So until the church begins to use a different kind of language and a different understanding and a different theology where they remove themselves from the center and that you put yourself on the margins and allow God to occupy the center, then we can have this space where we are doing the good work that God created in the beginning. Because in Revelation, we've got everybody standing around the throne. And nobody is in control but Jesus. And the Spirit is then speaking. And so I think when we have that kind of understanding, and that takes, that's going to take a lot of work on your part.
Amen. Amen.
It is. Because who's willing to give up the power? If you're not willing to give up the power and the language that you have learned to be socialized and function in your churches, you want them to be diverse, but you don't give up the power in order to have this equitable structure, then we're doing the same thing we've been doing for the last 600 years.
Wow.
I want to speak to this idea of giving up power and the idea of abundance, or what we believe about abundance or not. Because when you think about, I think about white privilege, I think of it as coming to an understanding of having some sort of power. But I also think of the fear of giving that up that I see manifested in the kinds of racist policies that we've structured as being a fear of losing something. So what is it that we really lose? You know, what really is it that I lose if I say I'm willing to give something up? I mean, I guess I come back to this because it's so clear to me in the gospel that what we are called to do is to give up our own self-centeredness, to give up our own running, our own sense of entitlement, our own sense that we have the only way to go. And so there's a kind of, it is sinful to think that we are only at the center. And I think that manifests in so many ways. It manifests along the lines that we call race. It manifests along the lines of religion. It manifests along the lines of what country we say we're from. And it is the sin of imperialism. It is the sin of militarism. It is the sin of racism. And we have created structures in our public policies and in our culture to perpetrate these. And so just going back to the previous question, and what are we doing? I think we have to always look at what are the seeds? What are the seeds that feed into those structures that are so destructive? It's the deconstruction, going back to the beginning and trying to eliminate those. Just continuing to go back at a deeper level and eliminating those is what we're called to do.
One of the pieces that Dr. King said in a Playboy interview a couple of weeks before his death, yeah, he was interviewed by Playboy, the preacher. But I think one of the challenges that he put before us all in that interview was that he was rethinking and this is what he shared with the reporter, he was rethinking the whole movement. And if we somewhat go back to January in his birthday, prior to his January's last birthday, he was in the basement of Ebenezer Baptist Church with a multicultural group of people, multiracial, multi-ethnic, whatever framing we want to use around that, organizing the Poor People's Campaign. And at that particular time, it was his view that all of these people had to be engaged because it was important that we pull together a coalition that represented the very vision of the beloved community. But the other part of it was the recognition that the movement itself had been hijacked, and it was being hijacked by folks up here on the Hill who were basically trying to pass quick legislation in order to move this along, by the African American community that was running away from the movement because they felt it had gone too far, and that they had gotten some of what they wanted. And the other part of it was the white liberals who had kind of hung on to the movement to express some level of liberality, but they too were being challenged by their own community for having gone too far. And so his statement was basically couched in this language. The purpose of the movement was not to be integrated out of power, but to be integrated into power. And what was happening was the movement was going further and further out of power, and people were losing power because the deals were being cut all over the place. That was cutting out a mass of people who actually he intended to step up, going all the way back to Birmingham, to the bus boycott in Montgomery. That's who he was with, poor people. And so rethinking the movement, and then the assassin's bullet in Memphis on April 4th, in a sense, cut all of that short of that particular segment of the movement. The question that I think we have been raising since then is, where is the next phase of the movement? And I would venture to say that it hasn't started yet, that we have a lot of work to do. And what is happening in this period, I believe, and this is my sanctified imagination going to work right now, that God is placing in the midst of us groups of people whose names we do not know and whose nationalities we can't figure out, but is putting them in a position whereby we are challenged now to engage a whole new learning. But not only that, to develop a movement that continues that other movement, but demands of us now to know more about these people than we ever had to know when we were just black folk and white folk. So this can't be a cursory movement. It has to be one that digs deep and understands the difference between Lao and Tao, and understands the difference between Indonesian and all of these kinds of nationalities of people who we say, as we said earlier, they all look alike, but in reality they don't. And they don't come with the same background. But if we are to know who they are, and if we are to connect with them in community, and what the church has been saddled with now is that not only do we have to know them, but we have to really know them, or we won't have, especially the white church, we will not have a church for the future. We will be a dwindling sect in the next 30 or 40 years, claiming in a sense that we have lost our way because of internal struggles and problems, of which, quite frankly, I'm a part of that now. But the reality is it will be by our own doing, because we did not go deep enough, once again, to reclaim the power and possibilities of getting to know a people and to stand in their stead when they could not stand for themselves, to help free them and liberate them, that they might be the vessels by which we can truly claim the rootage in the gospel of Jesus Christ.
All right.
As I see us engaging this, for me, I guess norms are different now. I think realities are different. When I think of Jesus asking the question, what would it profit a person to gain the whole world and lose their soul? I think there was a time where People might have been sort of, kind of concerned about their soul. People now just, I mean, it's not, the answer to that question now would be, yes, give me the money, or give me the resources and material. I mean, because there's more value in the profit of the world in those ways. So for me as the church, it's creating the same message, the same gospel of Jesus Christ in a different way. How do we get at the hearts of people? To change the heart. The scripture says the king's heart or the queen's heart is in the hand of the Lord. God turns it whithersoever God will. But like, how do we make that? How does that happen in a way when we're dealing with leaders that just have no moral compass at all, and don't have a desire to have it, and we're not even holding them accountable to have that as a part of our engagement with them. Dr. King could go to Johnson and others because there was a little bit, even though we're all sinful and there was sinfulness in there, but could kind of get at something that I don't think that people care about us getting at today.
Can I just say, everybody has to Google, if you didn't see it, Google Doonesbury's Today's Comic. It explains this exactly. It is the reframing of what evangelicals now believe and moderating what they actually think is sin, all based on what is being done in the administration. And it puts a humorous twist on what is exactly what you're saying, is that lack of moral fiber or even acknowledgement that it possibly could even exist.
Well, do you have questions out there? Just show of hands if you have questions. Okay. I mean, questions you've figured out that actually is a question, right? Okay. All right. So the way we're gonna do this is, I'm gonna trust Leslie or Andrea with my mic, and you're gonna come to the mic to ask your question. Oh, there's a mic out there as well. Okay, so don't ask the question from the floor without a mic, but stand up so we can see you have a question. Otherwise, you will accuse us of ignoring you, and it's because we can't see you. All right, so I'll give you this mic as well so that we can have two runners on both sides. No, there are people all over.
Well, there are two mics.
Oh, there are two mics out there? Yeah. Okay, very good. Oh, very good. Go.
All right.
I'm counting.
All right. So first is a real quick answer for you. It's the gospel of enough, and that's the answer to your question about inclusion and abundance. And then I have a real quick question for the audience. How many of you are excited about your church?
Oh, my church is.
That's not bad. That's not bad at all. That's pretty good. I didn't think it would be that high. And so then the question for you guys is, how do you think that advocacy plays into a new relevance for the church? Quotes.
I read a book years ago called When the Church Bell Rang Racist, the Methodist Church and the Civil Rights Movement in Alabama. And it's actually about, in those days, the Methodist Church in Alabama and around the country was officially segregated. So this was the story of a group of young white Methodist preachers in southern Alabama who were deeply impacted by Dr. King and decided consciously in community with one another that they were going to confront the racism in their congregations. And as they said to one another, we know we'll never be pastor at First Church. We'll never be district superintendent. We'll never be bishop. We'll probably get run out of town, but we're going to do it anyway because it's the right thing to do. So advocacy is not just in the halls of power in the sense of being at the state legislature or the city council or at the Capitol, U.S. Capitol. These are all great places for us to do advocacy, but a lot of times it is right there next to our sisters and brothers, and this is talking partly about our white fragility that we face all the time. We're afraid of making anybody upset and so forth. And somewhere along the way, we just have to have a grown-up faith where we say, this is, we can love one another, and we have to love one another, but we can say, I love you so much, I'm going to confront your racism and your ignorance about white privilege, and your refusal to get out there and be part of the change. And that's the kind of thing for us white folks that we've got to be part of in terms of our advocacy with one another in our congregations.
I agree on the broad sense of advocacy, but just to share that a couple years ago I was at a gathering and I did a workshop called Lobbying as a Spiritual Practice. Okay, just lobbying, not just broad advocacy, showing up in the offices of people who are making decisions every day about your welfare, about the welfare of millions of people across this country and billions of people across the globe. Showing up consistently, persistently, and speaking up on behalf of people and bring them with you. Bring them with you because people tell their own stories is the most powerful way to do it. But that is really an essential practice. I can't say what it means for the church, but I think we got to be all about it.
A few minutes ago, you were struggling for a word. 20 years ago, a refugee family moved next door to us from Somalia. They were Muslim. I learned that word. Islam means submission. Submission to God. I think that's the word we're looking for. And I think we need to submit to God, and we'll find the answer to a lot of our personal problems and our society problems.
Okay, did you have a question? That's it?
That's
okay,
it, ma'am.
That's all right. All right, thank you for that.
I have a theory that I'd like to check with the panel. The thing that happened at the Starbucks in Philadelphia 2 weeks ago, my theory is that white folk would say that was an isolated incident, and black folk would say that's an everyday occurrence. And so my question is, if Dr. King were alive today, what would he have to say about the movement? Have we progressed or have we regressed? And is there a black answer and a white answer to that question?
I just want to hear what y'all got to say about that. I sure want to hear the answer to that question.
The idea that it was isolated, I think the lie was put to that by the reaction and by folks waking up, and by Starbucks' response demonstrated the acknowledgement this was not isolated. This was systemic. So I take, while it's horrifying what happened, it's moderately encouraging that a big corporation is at least acknowledged and is trying to take steps to address implicit bias and all of the prejudice that we carry around with us. I think the bigger challenge is for all of us to be missionaries that express that and echo it and continue to talk about it so that it does not slip back into mission accomplished. Oh, isn't that nice? They had training on how to be aware. That's the step. But we, the people, have got to stay engaged, so it's not enough.
So I would add to that this is the black answer. It's all Wakanda forever. So the black answer for me is that when I saw that, and if King were alive, I would have to give him a call and go, we're done. We're done with shock and awe, because what we saw in these responses, I can't believe this is still happening. It never ended. It never ended. And what it is that then I posted this thing on Facebook about now we just have cameras. And so now that we have cameras, but we haven't done the hard work of saying that this has been going on since the beginning of the building of this nation. And so part of it is to stop the shock and awe. It's real, it happens. What are you going to do about it? That's the black question. And so, because Starbucks closed 800 stores for one day, 8,000 in one day, they're gonna close them for one day. What are they doing? So I wanna know, what's my question? The black question is, or the black response is, you know what, let's just open our own coffee shops. So I got this list. There were 37 black-owned coffee shops in Brooklyn. There's coffee shops in Philadelphia. You know what? We're just tired. You get tired of this. And so I was like, we're just gonna open our own coffee shops. Mine is gonna be Some Like It Black. Right? Some like it black, and some do, right? So, yes. And so I think it's time to say that, you know, corporation keep going, Starbucks keep going, but I think that it is time for us, and King, you know, for me was this giant. I do the work I do because of King, and then I do it because of the church that I belong to in Chicago. And so one of the very special ways right now is integration for him at that time was the role. And I'm not advocating that we don't integrate. I'm advocating that we move into a model of building structural black community again. And black-owned businesses, and We Buy Black. So on Instagram, We Buy Black is what I follow. And so, it's not just all black, but it is about how do we then build structure in our communities that we support so we're not shocked and awed. Ever.
Yes, I want to follow up on something that I guess his sister Simone said that you said you loved. And Reverend Tracy Blackman also raised this at another seminar where she basically said, our philosophy of trying to change the current president and administration is not a fruitful exercise because they're just mouthpieces, she said. That there are a lot of Christians behind the mouthpiece. So the question is, I feel as if we should stop wasting time lobbying politicians. On Sunday morning, all across this country, thousands upon thousands of people are delivering the message, and it's the wrong message. The way she said it was...
Okay, so what's the question?
The question is, here comes the question.
Come on.
How do we heal Christians? The way Christianity is practiced in America, if it was practiced differently, we wouldn't have Trump. How do we lobby Christians as opposed to lobbying politicians?
Okay, good question. Who wants to go? Anybody feeling bold?
I wanted to just kind of make push back a little bit on that. I do think that reform is needed in the Christian church. There's no question about it. It's needed in certainly the black church. I do want to suggest, however, that the church is not the only place by which black people and other people receive their information. There is a propaganda mill out here that actually begins at the root of transforming whole Christian communities. This left, right, and middle Christianity / left, right, and middle politics. And it is defined by a list of things that we say we believe and that the other folks believe who are not either what I am. And I think this is a great challenge because what it has done is segmented not only the human spirit, but is also segmenting the political realities that we are facing. And so this conservative evangelical, where I came from in South Carolina, conservative evangelical in my day were fundamentalists. And fundamentalists were racist. And they didn't have a problem letting you know that. And now what we have done is, in a sense, shifted the nomenclature. And that is to suggest, well, I'm conservative, right? And in this, what we are seeing is almost the same set of rules with regards to supremacy. and white supremacy that we saw with the fundamentalists. The difference with the fundamentalists is they would come out with the sheets and the torches. Today, there are other mechanisms in place, i.e. incarceration, mass incarceration of African American people, a number of other ways, police shootings and police with guns, that can do the same thing that with what has now replaced the theology of fundamentalism. And I want to suggest that what the trap is either to call us into being anti-political, where this doesn't matter, but it does. Legislation is passed every single day that is crippling our communities all across this nation. And when I read a recent book, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, and also heard the author speak with regards to the issue of housing in the United States and the redlining of houses among African American people during the 1950s and 60s, it came from the party known as Democrat. And so all of these houses we lost, the communities we lost, the communities torn down, all of this came not just from one party, but both of them. Over time, we've had to deal with the issues of both of them. So the question of this is, how do we then deal with a historic connection to a political force that over the years has never really served in the best interest of the poor, which includes white folk too, and people of color, and that has no, in this present day, has no expectation to do it in the year 2000 plus. And if we don't monitor this and connect with this, and if the black church and other churches, white churches have to do it too. I've been to white churches that have refugees and dealing with sanctuary in those churches as well. If we don't do this, then who does the work? And what do we own with regards to faith and religion? You know, when I was a pastor, I depended every Sunday morning for one, some folk to show up. And two, when the plate was passed, I expected them to put something in it. And I'm saying that from the standpoint that if we're talking about institution building that has no essential purpose for the freeing of God's people, then it's time to find another church.
Dr. Bridge, for me, one of the things is valuing the intersectionalities. I remember the church, the ELCA in particular, after the 2009 church-wide decision to be open and affirming and full inclusion. And I sat at tables for candidacy committees and mobility processes that determines where people go for various churches. And I saw the church rally up, and I asked questions in particular, directing new candidates. If we send you to this church, are you going to pull this church out because of the issue of human sexuality? And they almost, and we're really not supposed to do that, but they almost kind of made it an ultimatum. Like if you were going to pull the church out of, the union because of human sexuality, they weren't going to put you in that church. So that kind of put some people out or whatever. Well, I did not see them do that same thing in the answer to the question of racial equality. No, when that question never gets asked, or if someone shows signs, and we know through candidacy that there are some candidates that have shown signs of racial or implicit bias and things like that, and we still put them in the church. That means for me, we have to change and get on and change people who sit at these tables in these candidacy committees and other things so that we can make sure that there's a collective unity that moves us forward to stopping that stuff. This stops today.
This question.
It's on.
It's on.
Oh, sorry. My question is, and I want to say something to back it up after I ask the question. Where are the youth? And my question comes from, where are we as church bringing in, nurturing, and listening to and learning from the youth? I'm so heartened by the many, many, many groups of extremely strong youth. And when you talked about chaos and community. That's where I'm seeing a lot of community. It's not necessarily community that is faith-based or has any connection to church. And how do we as church learn from these young people?
So part of that, I have worked for the United Church of Christ, and I started Millennials for Racial Justice. And part of the movement is, and I've been to churches that don't have any youth or any millennials or any families or any babies or anybody that is going to carry on the legacy of the church. And so it behooves the church, all of the church, to look for and start partnering with organizations that have youth. And I know that some churches are not in those spaces, but it is an intentional reaching out to millennials and developing the relationships. One, they don't trust the church because the church has not been very present in their movement. And there is a movement, going on. There is a new movement. And so these young people that were part of both the March Against Guns, though that's a space to reach out. These youth that are walking out of their schools, that's a space to reach out. There are youth out there, but churches have become so closed door and siloed and so fearful of the movement, activism, and advocacy of youth that they don't invite them in even to stand in the pulpit. And then you have the intersectionality of the fear of young women standing in spaces where old men are still occupying pulpits, that they don't want to listen to the next segment of seasoned youth who've been out there for a very long time. And that's across the spectrum. And so that invitation means that it needs to come, you have to go to where they are. They're not coming into your building, so you got to get up and go.
So I just want to say that I think part of us have all, as we have been spiritually formed, we have had to think about how do we imagine God? How do we imagine the divine? What I'm seeing among young people that I connect with is they're imagining the divine in ways that aren't the same as necessarily what the church structures have been. And I think the question is, there are generational differences, and are we open to seeing and listening and hearing that?
And can I just say that I am a member of a church. I live in Ohio, but my church is still in Philadelphia. I am a member of a church that is bringing in millennials regularly. It's a 128-year-old American Baptist church. We sing hymns, so it's not even that it's, quote, doing contemporary music, whatever. In fact, I don't even know that we do anything particularly that somebody would call millennial. You know what I mean? But what matters is the church has made a commitment that it has lived out over and over again, which is to be active in its community and to be open to change. So the church that is hermetically sealed and living into the history it knows and unwilling to move, no, you don't have any young people. That has nothing to do with because you don't have donuts on Sunday morning. See, I had a coughing fit, and then I came back. No, honestly, I'm not trying. I know I'm being funny, but I'm not really trying to be, which is to say that I believe that if the church is reaching out to young people out of fear of dying, nobody wants to come to your funeral. No, really. I don't want to come to the funeral. But if the church, the joke at St. Paul's Baptist Church in Philadelphia used to be, come to St. Paul's and live forever. Because we have all these 70, 80, and 90-year-old people who are a hoot. And they are some of the most active and activist people on the face of the planet. They draw young people because young people are moved by their commitment to the gospel. Who's moved by your commitment?
And then there is the intersectionality of Black queer folks who belong to white church spaces. So, because oh, hey, hi Rev, hi Bishop. Facebook friend, what's that? So for those of us, I belong to two churches, to Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, and also to Riverside Church in New York City. I joined Riverside in 2005 because Reverend Wright was concerned about how out I am. He said that. And you know it was truth. So he said, I'm concerned about how out you are, because you're going to have issues up in black spaces. You just going to have issues. And that was truth. But then what we didn't realize was how black I am up in white spaces. And I've just received a letter from a church.
So what's the question?
Oh, so the question is for...
So what's the question?
You know it's about to be a sermon. I'm sorry.
Yes. Take a deep breath. What's the question?
Lord. Okay.
They passed me the mic because they were scared to ask you what the question was.
Yeah, they were.
What's the question?
Okay. So how do we sort of be in conversation about that for Black queer folks who are trying to navigate this system? How do we name it and claim safe prophetic spaces?
Okay.
Yeah. Hey.
So, Lamont, you got something to say about this? See, I reached for you because you brought it up. But while he's getting the mic and anybody else that wants to answer this, the question around space for all God's people belongs to all of us, right? I mean, I hear you about what it means for Black queer folk to be safe in Black space. You know that word safe is having the same place in my crawl as inclusion. So I'm trying to think about what bravery looks like.
I think sometimes we can get cynical or frustrated, cynical and the polar opposites, and just feel like, what's the use, not answering the question, but staying or dealing with the question. James Baldwin, the quote, he says, if I love you, I have to make you conscious of those things that you don't see. And for me, if we could, as queer folk or whatever, just keep encouraging one another to stay in the spaces, to seek the transformation. I know sometimes it's unhealthy, and I never would tell anybody to stay in a situation that is unsafe or unhealthy. But I think of Dr. Bridgman all the time, and who actually came to the African Descent Lutheran Association conference with the Union of Black Episcopalians, who made me aware of Pauli Murray, right? And the work that she was able to accomplish in her denomination. We don't have many models that we lift up and appreciate to be able to see those intersectionalities. So I think it's about encouraging one another, finding those supportive systems that allow us to remain and to seek the change and transformation in those spaces.
And I just want to add, as a Catholic sister who was in an organization that got dissed by the Vatican, it is a reality to feel uncomfortable, and for various reasons. And I want to say that the gospel is at the heart of who we are. And if the gospel is at the heart of who we are, then it's about love triumphs in whatever form I am created by the loving divine to live it. And part of the suffering Jesus in today's world is living love in these spaces where we're not necessarily wanted. But so I want to say that I'm not Black, I'm not queer, I'm not in that section of discomfort, but I think we all experience some level of discomfort, and the whole challenge is to live in love for the Lord Jesus Christ, no matter what.
Okay, so I'm deeply aware that we are almost out of time. So this brother right here has been on his feet from the beginning. And so I absolutely want to hear his question. And this brother has been waiting from the beginning. So, and there's a young person in back. What's your name, baby? I can see you, but I can't. Okay, Brenda. So, Brenda, make your way up here. So those three people, and if we have some time. Okay, well, let's do some negotiation. Let's do some negotiation. Let's Andrea, capture the questions over here. If you have a question, get over here. Let us capture your question. I know I would rather hear it in your voice, but just this once, come on, y'all. Come over here by Andrea. Capture the questions. And only one person is going to respond, and the responses are going to be shorter. How about that? We're going to, this is the lightning round. So, this is the lightning round. So, this is where you figure out your question, help them to shorten it, so whatever. We were supposed to end at 9. Can I covenant with you all for another 15 minutes of your time? Are we good for 15 more minutes? See? That wasn't much of a negotiation. I feel kind of Abrahamic now. What if I said 30 more minutes? No, I'm kidding. I was kidding about that. Okay. All right.
Okay.
So, are we ready?
Yes.
All right, go. Do we have his name since we don't have his voice? What's your name, sir? Marion Jarman.
Marion says, how do you deconstruct the theology of those who were oppressors who are foundational for the theology for which you live and function, like in the Black church?
He said Black church?
Well, he's looking at if you are dealing with racism and so forth, coming from even a Black church or a white church, how do you deconstruct that theology?
That's me.
One answer.
One answer. Carefully. One way to deconstruct theology in church is to look at your cultural root. What I mean by that is that theology has been constructed mainly by white theologians, and ways in which you reclaim theology is out of a cultural context and voices that speak to the identity of who you are before your ancestors were captured and brought into a colonial theology. That does help, and I can talk to you more about that afterwards.
Okay. Do we have a name?
We have a challenge.
Okay.
The challenge to the questions regarding queer space, for Black people in queer space, is that my sister feels that you did not really address that, because there's a challenge for queer space for Black people in Black spaces as well as in white spaces.
Right. Okay, so can I take this one? Y'all good with me taking this? Over here. So I have a couple of really quick responses. One is that I do experience, I am now on a 2-year jaunt of teaching in Black churches around sexuality. I've been called to several Black churches that you wouldn't even imagine would call me to teach around sexualities. I'm putting the S on that. So I think that slowly Black churches are changing, and then you have organizations like the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries that pull churches in from all denominations, where people who are queer identified find both a place to breathe and also learn together. So I think the church, I've just helped 3 different Black churches work on their statements of open and affirming. 2 of them are Baptist churches. One of them is in a denomination that's supposed to already be open and affirming, but that's a whole nother story. But I think what you're finding in black churches is that many of them, back to this question about theology, are more invested in white evangelicalism and white supremacist theology. And it's hard to divest from that when that has been tied to your grandmama's Jesus. Because we are afraid that we are rejecting our grandmama and not just the theology. So I think it's slowly happening in places. You have to look for the churches, like our church I just mentioned. You have to look for the churches, but there are absolutely many black churches. It is a lie that black churches are more homophobic than white churches. That's just a lie. It's a lie. There are many open and affirming, or don't ask, don't tell, black churches that are accepting of queer life. That actually, when I say queer life, I mean people are pastoring. I can name 5, 6 churches right now. People are pastoring, serving as deacons, serving as leaders in the church. So is the question, are they there, or how do you find them? I see your hand. Oh, I didn't say that was good. Okay, we got to go to the other questions. I agree with you, but you're saying you disagree with me, and I'm telling you that I'm actually having these experiences. So that we can talk about that offline.
All right. So my question is more related to intersectionality and in a practical point of view, if you can pinpoint of resources. Being an Afro-descendant woman from the Caribbean, particularly from Puerto Rico, I find myself at the border of many things in my life, right? And it's really hard to put labels on who I think. I consider myself a black woman, and some people would say you're brown or things like that. So it's hard for me to become somebody that I cannot see, right? And I look at this panel and everything that we're doing this weekend. So you mentioned the importance of knowing who you are in order to make a change, and I think Dr. King was on point about that. So could you point resources that I can look into? I'm not planning on going to seminar, and I'm not a preacher, and that will help me tremendously to move forward. Thank you.
So after we're done, I can give you some resources that are culturally contextual, and I also have some pastors that are Latino Puerto Rican that I can give you.
Okay, I just wanted to make a point. I went to these panel discussions, when I was in high school, when Dr. King was assassinated. And the only person really who would be on a panel like this maybe is this man here on the end. But my comment or question is that those of us who are the least of these changes over time. I came from a very white racist family, and when King was killed, what my parents said was, "I'm glad they killed that communist." Not the N-word, but communist. So it changes, and I just want to say that right now I feel that people with disabilities are among the least of these that aren't being recognized. And the reason I'm not going to the Hill tomorrow is because there's no provision that I have seen anywhere about people who have mobility impairments or any other impairments attending on the buses.
I will respond that there was a question in the registration that says what accommodations are needed. And if we that is not something that we would ever want to not address.
Right.
Well, I'm the last, I guess. And thank you for your panel. It has been absolutely fantastic. And the more I listen to you, the more questions I have. And I know. I know. I know. Yeah, I know. Some of you preach from the pulpit. I preach in classrooms and workshops around the country. I teach workshops on white privilege, on building cultures of respect, and other things. And I'm not a member of the church. I don't work for the church. I am here because I will not stay quiet in my overwhelmingly white German Lutheran church. And they sent me here. They said, well, you're always talking about these issues. Why don't you go? I said, yeah. So, you asked about inclusion. I teach about respect and inclusion. I put them together. My question, I have a question. I have a question.
Really, what's the question?
But my question is for all of you. That's why I wanted to have a microphone.
So what's the question? Really, honestly, what's the question?
I have 3 comments. Each comment has the same question. Listen to the Yes?
No.
Okay,
the question.
that's fine. Then there is no point.
Well, thank you.
My question is, what are you doing about 3 things that I wanted to respond to what you said?
What are the 3 things?
The 3 things about inclusion. One is, you said yourself that inclusion has this connotation of being my table. I call it my tent. And what you didn't have a word, you said. And I don't have a word either. But what I do say in my training is what we need to do at the tent is to come up.
I'm sorry, brother. I'm interrupting you because this is not a question. So
I have a question if you will listen.
No. Here you go. Hold that. So, so if you want to talk to us offline, we will do that. But it is fair that we ask everybody to do a question and not a comment. And so let me thank the panelists. Would you help me thank the panelists? And I want to end with a poem that you may have heard at some point by the writer is Carl Wendell Hines Jr. It's a poem about Dr. King right after he was killed. It's called A Dead Man's Dream. Now that he is safely dead, let us praise him. Build monuments to his glory. Sing hosannas to his name. Dead men make such convenient heroes, for they cannot rise to challenge the images that we might fashion from their lives. It is easier to build monuments than to build a better world. So now that he is safely dead, we, with eased consciences, will teach our children that he was a great man, knowing that the cause for which he lived is still a cause, and the dream for which he died is still a dream, a dead man's dream. It is easier to build movements than to build monuments than to build a better world. Let's go build a better world.
Thank you. Hello? Hello? Okay. Okay, if you could just give me one moment. Thank you all for hanging in here with us. Let's give our panelists another round of applause. I knew this would be hard to do even in 2 hours, and it's always hard to ask questions when we all are experts in different things and we all want to really engage in conversation. So we can still do that. Tonight, I know that people will be hanging around a little bit and we'll be having conversation. Angelique is in the room now, so if we could just thank her stand up, for all of her hard work. she roped so many of her colleagues into being with us this weekend. And Kevin Nelson, he was helping us. Thank you for helping us with the mics, and Andre and everyone. I want to just close out just very, very quickly with a couple of things. My son said to me, I was really busy, and things were coming up over and over again, and my son said to me, Mom, can I have $200 just put in my account? I said, $200? He said, yeah, I just need $200 in my account. I said, why do you need $200 in your account? You just had money, so I go through the whole long list as a mother would do. And he's like, well, I just want some more money in my account. And I said, no, that's not gonna happen. I'm not giving you any more money in your account. He said, you actually can say no to things, number one. This is my child. So the whole piece about rest, about saying no, about self-care, as we were in the height of the healthcare fight, I had agreed to teach at a women's retreat, and we were supposed to be going on the Hill. Well, we were on the Hill, we were doing another prayer vigil, and then we had access to the Senate gallery. So senators were gonna be walking out of the gallery, and we were gonna be praying for them as they were walking out of the gallery. And so I had to leave because I had made a commitment before I knew this was all gonna happen to teach at a women's retreat in Virginia. And so I was so torn about what I would do. But I had been praying, we had been meeting over and over again with members of Congress. We have been doing everything within our power. I told you this story, Diane. And as I was wrestling with, okay, what am I gonna say to the people who are expecting me, the Lord, I believe, stopped me in my tracks. And what was in my spirit was, you have done all that you can do. Go to the retreat. And I had to stop, I had to breathe, I had to just take a moment to realize I was not in control of how the senators voted. I had already done everything that was in my power to do, and I needed to go to the retreat and do this other commitment and have some time of respite myself. So my question is, so just in terms of how we take care of ourselves and what we need to do as we continue this work. And please do not let anybody, I know it seems like what we do and going and meeting with these people and they're gonna tell you something and tell you one thing and do something else. This is important and it matters. It matters a lot. It is not a waste of time. There's plenty for us to do, and certainly one of those things is to go up on the Hill. And in terms of racism and ending racism, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but we can start here. So as we leave, I just want to take a moment of silence for the people who were killed, again, from gun violence. We started out talking with the National School Walkout and heard from some young people who are doing prophetic work on ending gun violence. Today, a young person went and shot up a Waffle House, and 4 people were murdered. And so, again, we are faced with using an AR-15, or that same rifle. And so if we could just take a moment of silence just to remember those lives, and then we will pray and go about our evening's rest. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayers. We bless you, we thank you, God, for even moving right now. Help us to be courageous and brave, to do the deeper work that you are calling us to do, to be radical lovers of you and also radical lovers of one another, to extend hospitality to all, and to be your hands and feet in the world. In Jesus' name, amen. Good night, and God bless you.